Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and very welcome to all of you to attend our webinar today on the topic of ultra-processed food. What does it mean in terms of technology? What does it mean in terms of consumer? What does it mean in terms of even definition? So to discuss this in more detail, I have two guests today, Matt and Shimi. Both are directors and owners of food bowls. And we also have Shay, who is coordinating our webinar, interacting with our audience, maybe gathering some questions and answers that we can go through together today. So without further ado, we are just going to go through a couple of key items today. We are going to cover the definition, the classification of ultra-processed food. We're going to look at the pros and cons of ultra-processed food. What does it mean in terms of product category, in terms of nutritional profile? We're also going to look at it from a consumer perspective. What are the choices that consumers must make when they look at the different types of products that are available? And how can we guide them in their choices and preferences? And then drilling a little bit more on the processing and technology of ultra-processed food, we will go through some of the specific criteria that need to be taken into account when we develop and commercialize those type of products. So just in terms of introduction, Matt and Shimi, would you like just to give us a little bit of an overview on who you are and why you're here today?
Thank you, Raphael, for the introduction and for facilitating this webinar. And hello to everyone joining us here today. So I'm Shimi and this is Matt, and together we founded Food Buzz Consulting. We are a research and development agency focused on creating products from concept to launch with a strong emphasis on drinks development. We look at the application of science to create products that not only taste great, but are also technically sound. And in order to achieve this, we have an array of equipment which we use to test products that mimic conditions which are as close to the factory or production conditions as far as possible. And this kind of helps bridge the gap between what we can develop on a laboratory scale and what can be achieved on a production scale. So this gives our clients and the brands that we work with confidence to progress to scale up. So that's kind of us in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that's everything, really. Yeah.
So let's make a start and look at some of those definitions. I mean, I know there is quite a lot of confusion on what ultra-processed foods actually are. And Shimi, can you maybe give us a little bit of a definition and what's in scope here for today's discussion?
Of course, yes. So before we can unveil the enigma that is UPF, I guess the question is, what is UPF? It basically means ultra-processed foods. And the person who's credited to coining the definition and this terminology is Professor Carlos Monteiro, who's a professor of public health and nutrition in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He wrote an article that was published by the Food and Agriculture Organization in the United Nations. And in this paper, he actually defines what UPF is. So it's basically edible food-like substances in a nutshell, but it is basically made up of ingredients that are of industrial scale. In other words, ingredients that you would never find in your kitchen cupboard. And it is also made using industrial processes, example, thermal processing, something we will go into a lot more detail later on in the webinar. But basically, UPFs are made from ingredients that are derived from other ingredients or other substances. And they often contain additives and emulsifiers, which serve a very specific purpose, which is to enhance the sensory qualities of that food and make it more palatable and sometimes hyper-palatable. So that's kind of what the definition of UPF is. So if we move on to the next slide. So moving on to the next slide.
There might be a bit of a lag, Shimi. Can you see it now?
Yes, can do. Thank you. So Professor Monteiro also developed and designed the NOVA food classification system. This basically categorizes the food that we eat into 4 main groups, depending on the type and the extent of processing that it undergoes. This list, so basically this kind of gives the consumers a snapshot of the 4 different classifications of these food groups. So you have group 1, which is the green group. It basically contains foods that are unprocessed or have been minimally processed, and we will give examples of the typical foods that lie within each category further into this presentation. But for now, so in a more simplistic way, so group 1 is basically your green group, which contains unprocessed and minimally processed foods. Group 2 are the processed culinary ingredients, which are standalone ingredients that are added to other food items. And then you have group 3, which are processed foods, which contain foods from group 1 and 2 and have undergone some kind of a preservation method to extend their shelf life. And finally, we have group 4, which is the red group, and this is the ultra-processed food group. So now we'll go into examples of the typical kind of foods that fall within each category. Just to roll over. Yeah, so this list is not exhaustive by any means, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the kind of foods that typically fall within the NOVA classification system. So in group 1, we have fresh frozen fruits, vegetables, grains, pulses, eggs, or things that are minimally processed, for example, milk and plain yogurt. Then we have in group 2 are the ingredients that are added to other kinds of foods. Typically, you wouldn't eat these by themselves, but they are added to other food components. Then we have group 3, the orange group, which contains food substances added from group 1 and 2, which have undergone a kind of preservation to help extend the shelf life. So these include things like veg and fish, which are in cans, beer, wine, cider, salted nuts and seeds. And finally, we have group 4, which is the category that is UPF. And this includes ready meals, sugar and sweetened drinks, confectionery, biscuits, cereals, and even things like infant formula, and as well as burgers and sausages. And here I must mention that it includes most breakfast cereals. There are, of course, some outliers like shredded wheat or ready bread, which doesn't quite fall into the UPF category. So it all depends on the type and extent of the processing these foods undergo. So this, again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it just gives us a very sort of broad overview of the kind of typical foods from our daily lives that fall within the NOVA classification system.
Thank you very much, Amy. I think, we're starting to have a better understanding now of how to define ultra-processed food and how they can be categorized. So my understanding is that, there is a certain amount of processing that is required in order to ensure that we have products that are of acceptable quality and safe throughout their shelf life. But there are boundaries among those in terms of, how much can food be processed and hiding maybe some of those ingredients that might not be as healthy or as nutritional as others. However, though, in terms of commercial value, I don't think we can overlook how much ultra-processed food we probably eat or drink every day, and what does it mean from a financial perspective. So I think this slide probably captures some of those important elements. If you can go through that with us, please.
Absolutely. So UPFs are obviously very pervasive in terms of the food that we eat on a daily basis. Consequently, there's a lot of sales and marketing of the UPFs. So it's a massively profitable sector, of course, compared to the unprocessed food category, for example. So there's a huge commercial value associated with UPFs because of the sheer presence of it, not just on a local scale, but on a macro, on a global scale. So these are some of the interesting statistics. So in the more developed countries like USA, UK, or Canada, UPFs can make up for actually more than half of the total calories consumed. In the more developing countries like Mexico, Brazil, Chile, these figures are quickly catching up. So they make up for about anywhere between a third to a fifth, so around 20 to 33% of the total calories consumed. However, one thing is clear, that the global sales of UPFs are increasing. And depending on whether it's the high income countries or the lower income countries, the growth in sales of UPFs can be anywhere sort of between 1 and 10% on an annual basis. So I think all this to say that the size of the prize here is pretty substantial as far as UPFs go.
Thank you. And again, if we go into a little bit more granularity and what synergies, what differences we can see between UPF and nutrition. Because on one side, what I'm hearing is that
absolutely. So
UPFs...
this is a very sort of interesting part of this discussion. So here on the left-hand side of your screen, we have the very definition of UPFs and some of the negative sort of connotations associated with it. So for example, yes, UPFs are made from chemicals or ingredients people can't identify it with. And yes, they change the sensory qualities of food to make them hyperpalatable, and that UPFs are created from industrial processes. But on the right-hand side of your screen are some of the nutritional benefits that are made possible by the use of these very same industrial ingredients and these very same industrial processes. So an example of this is vitamin and mineral fortification. So if we take the example of plant-based milks, they contain added vitamin B12, D, and calcium. And without the benefit, without the accessibility to ultra-processing, it would not be possible. This also applies to mineral fortification, for example, in certain breads and cereals. Another very good examples are macronutrient enrichment. So, for example, fibers and proteins. It is through the use of these kind of industrial techniques and processes that these kind of macronutrients are much more accessible to us on a daily basis as consumers. Now, proteins, for example, is available as an isolate, which is kind of the highest form of purity. And it's available as powdered isolates, which can help boost our protein intake on a daily basis. Then we have dietary fibers, which are kind of available now as soluble dietary fiber. And we know that, ingestion of soluble dietary fibers have a massively positive impact on our gut microbiome, and ultimately it leads to positive health outcomes. So all of this is made possible through the power of processing. Another example is the use of probiotics. There's a very clever piece of technology called microencapsulation, which basically encases bacteria or the good strains of beneficial bacteria to make them more process tolerant. So they're shielded from thermal processing and they don't die off during thermal processing, which means that, that probiotics can now be added to different types of food. Another great example of the benefits of how UPFs can create nutritionally enhanced foods is meal replacements. Some of these kind of meal replacement drinks are available on a prescription basis because they're important for certain vulnerable sections of the population. For example, those recovering from surgery or those who can't chew their foods. So modifying the texture of these foods and making them more palatable is absolutely vital. Another example of a surprising inclusion of UPF is infant formulas. As we know that they are absolutely critical, necessary, or even life-saving in certain situations. So I guess, the key takeaway from this is that perhaps it isn't just about banishing all UPFs or demonizing kind of the foods that fall under the UPF umbrella, but it's basically more about choosing nutrient-dense foods wherever they may fall on the UPF classification or the processing spectrum.
Thank you very much. Certainly important to understand that UPF and nutrition do not always conflict. And in fact, there are loads of ways and means of accessing nutrition through UPF. So thank you very much for the clarification.
Problem. So moving on, I guess we can summarize some of the benefits of UPFs. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, but some of the obvious benefits of UPFs are as follows. First and foremost is obviously food safety, and this is directly related to the extent of processing or thermal processing the foods can undergo, or ingredients that are added to it to to help improve food safety. So basically, it means that food is microbiologically stable over longer periods of time. And as a direct consequence of this, food can now be transported over longer distances to places where such foods never existed before. So consumers basically now have a much more diverse food choice. They're able to make those choices also based on convenience factors, the ease of preparation of foods, and kind of how it fits into their lifestyle, their shopping habits. So all of this kind of feeds into consumer choices. We've already mentioned that UPFs, they have improved flavor and texture. So these foods are generally a lot more palatable and a lot more acceptable by the general population. And overall, there's less wastage because food is no longer made fresh to order, nor does it have limited shelf life anymore. So some of the limitations that we used to have before have now been eliminated because of UPFs.
Thank you for going through that with us today, Shimi. And certainly for our audience, if you have any questions to ask, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will address those either during the webinar today or afterwards. So thank you for being here, for your engagement, and please don't hesitate to have a discussion in the background. So moving on, maybe on the consumer, what does it mean, the consumption of ultra-processed food, and how, as people who work in this industry, can engage with our consumer and maybe explain, educate, communicate some of the benefits of ultra-processed food. So I think, there has been a couple of very interesting surveys, certainly here in Europe, and I would be curious to see if our audience have any data in other parts of the world. But here in Europe, there has been a very significant survey being conducted, and the statistics, really, the numbers speak for themselves. So if we go through how consumers perceive ultra-processed food, it is very clear here, as we can see, that we have about 65% that associate ultra-processed food with being unhealthy. They are also connected to metabolic disease like obesity or diabetes. It seems like there is a dislike as well of ingredients that they cannot easily recognize. They do have a lack of trust in the regulation of ultra-processed food. And they also associate plant-based substitute with being ultra-processed. And overall, 56% would say that they actually try to avoid processed food. So again, there seems to be a little bit of a mismatch here between the definition and how we can categorize ultra-processed foods and the benefit versus the consumer perception of those type of products. And I didn't know that there were actually some regulation of ultra-processed food, or again, is it just down to consumer perception? So Shimi or Matt, can you maybe explain to us a little bit more about what this means on your side?
Yeah, so in terms of regulations, that obviously the term itself is already quite old, but there's no specific regulation on ultra-processed foods. The only thing that comes close to it at this point in time will be a European Nutri-Score and British HFSS scoring and traffic light on the front or back of pack. And this is as far as we are concerned. This is as far as we can get at the moment to help consumers understand what's inside the packaging. This is quite useful because obviously in a combination with ingredients declaration on the back of pack, people can understand a little bit better what they consume. But also at the same time, these scoring systems are sort of a double-edged sword. We can have a sugary cereal with fortified with a fiber, scoring better than a slice of cheese, basically. So as you can see, it's not always a black and white on this one. So and one, obviously, if you think about it, will be more processed than another. So it's not always that simple, basically. So I think we'll need a little bit more regulations and guidelines on what's good and what's bad for you. Not only on the processing side, as Shimi explained, some ultra processed foods are really important. We talk about fortified beverages, for instance, where the vitamin and minerals are added. Generally, this is a good thing. Same for protein and meal replacement drinks. So with certain examples, this is very important to have product more processed, so it's more accessible and more macro and micronutrients are available basically in a single portion, which is very important.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. And I think, in terms of packaging innovation, this is an excellent example how brands and manufacturers can engage with their audience and through education and communication of some of those benefits of those products and the nutritional profile of those that is available on the food label. But I think that traffic light system is basically an easy way to guide consumers through their choices and preference when it comes down to food and beverages type of product. So thank you very much also for highlighting some of those outliers in terms of how, again, brands, food manufacturers can guide their consumer through better choices, but also understanding the different classification, how they can easily make the different ingredient that they use fall into one classification versus another. So it seems like, there is an opportunity to engage with the consumer and also to select the ingredients and the formulation that will benefit the consumer from a nutritional perspective, but also fall into a different category on the Nutri-Score or the labelings that are used for guidance in the UK. So thank you very much for that. I was actually reading also a report in the UK where they had 75,000 consumers, and in this report, it was very clear that consumers had heard about ultra-processed food, but couldn't explain what it is for 50% of those consumers, and 20% hadn't heard about ultra-processed food in the past. So again, an opportunity here to educate and also to bring some transparency on the quality of the product in terms of nutritional profile or ingredient list to engage with the audience. So thank you very much for going through that. And let's move on maybe to some of those key areas and topics that are important from a consumer perspective. So what I have read, and those are the thoughts that I have gathered here, is what are the motivation for consumers to consume ultra-processed food? And I think we touched on that already. It's about convenience, it's about price, it's about taste, it's about ease of preparation, and it's about value. So very important to, again, educate on the benefit of those type of products. We did go through the quality and safety aspect of those type of products throughout shelf life, but this is aligned with the consumer's perception as to why they would consume those type of products. On the other side, though, it is important as well to understand some of those front pack label and how we can address some of the challenges that are associated with ultra-processed food. So maybe I just open the floor here to yourself, Shimi. Anything that you have actually learned or experienced around the consumer's choice of ultra-processed food, and how we can potentially address those?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. Now, I think it does go back to sort of transparency and also awareness, because I think the distinction between certain types of foods are not very clear, for instance. So for, like I mentioned earlier on during this webinar, that there are certain types of cereals which are not ultra processed. So, for example, shredded wheat. But there are also certain types of foods which are surprisingly included in the banner of ultra processed foods. For example, a tin of baked beans. Now, some people might argue that it's probably the national food of England. But what we need to also understand is a tin of baked beans. Half a tin of baked beans, for instance, provides as much protein as 2 eggs. So, there are certain foods that kind of fall into this category, but we really have to look at the nutritional benefits of these kind of foods. Crisps is another example. So, for instance, if it's flavored crisps, it falls into UPFs. But if it's plain salted, it doesn't. So there are these little nuances, which ultimately boils down to how aware a consumer is when they're making these kind of choices on a daily basis, and what information and guidelines are available to help them make those choices. So that's kind of my experience of it, or my understanding of it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for, again, summarizing it so well in terms of how some of those definition terminology can really help our consumer to navigate their way through those choices, and also how, as brand owners and people who manufacture those type of products, we can also take those into account when we develop and commercialize those products. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think that's a kind of an interesting segue into this specific slide, because I think, the plant-based type of products or dairy alternative is certainly a category that has been challenged a bit. And here we can see similar type of products that can be either stored in the fridge, in the refrigerated section of our retail shops, but they can also be stored in the long shelf life type of shelves. So I'm curious to hear, what does it mean from a consumer perspective, and even in terms of processing and technology? Are those products actually the same?
Yeah, so this one is quite interesting. So I'll maybe start with consumer perception. So obviously, and this is something that comes from the history when milk, before the technology actually got to the point where we were able to produce product aseptically. Just natural products like dairy milk, cow's milk, was only stored in the refrigerator. So that's where that refrigeration storage is coming from. When the consumer thinks or picks the product from the refrigerators, they think it's much fresher than anything from the ambient valley. And that used to be the case. But nowadays, and obviously I don't talk about all these produce on both photos, but some of the products on the left-hand side, so on the salt in the chill valley, will be processed exactly the same as the product on the right-hand side. So there will be no significant difference between both of them. In some cases, it will be slightly different processing temperature, and we'll get into that in more details further down on another slide. And sometimes it's just a type of the packaging itself. Some will be ESL and some will be aseptic. There are slightly different type of filling equipment, basically. So we are talking about technological differences rather than the formulation itself.
Thank you, Matt. So in terms of consumer perception, I think it's very important to take some of those nuances into account during the development and the commercialization, because depending on the target segment, depending on the value proposition, obviously things would have to be taken into account, the right criteria and parameters, in order to make sure that our consumer can find the product in the right location, and that the offering in terms of whether it is convenience, whether it is long shelf life, whether it is freshness, are being taken into account in the design and the formulation of those products. But what I'm hearing is that from a processing and technology perspective, we are probably very similar here. So let's kind of go through that in more details, because I know you have a lot of experience in the processing of beverages, and I'm just very curious to see what the differences are in terms of time and temperature, and maybe something that our audience would be interested to hear as well. So how can we categorize those parameters, and how do they apply to different type of product categories? Matt, can you explain to us a little bit in detail what this means?
Of course. So this slide, those 4 categories are simplified. So just for the sake of this discussion, we just decided to simplify thermal processing a little bit, because it's obviously more complex, and we could just keep or make a separate presentation on each of these thermal processes. But just as an overview, we can divide the thermal processes on 2 main groups. One is more traditional way of pasteurization, and the second one will be more advanced type of thermal process, which is sterilization. So in the pasteurization, we'll have a slightly different type of time and temperatures. The most traditional one will be low temperature with the long time. This generally applies these days to high acid products. So we're talking about carbonated beverages, for instance, or certain juices as well. But juices actually these days will be processed with HTST, which is a second type of pasteurization, slightly more advanced. This one goes slightly higher in terms of the temperature, and therefore our processing time will be shorter. The way of calculating, maybe I'll put it that way, of time and temperature, it depends on the type of product, for sure, and the time level of the acidity as well. So if the acid is there's more acid in the product, we can go with the lower temperature. If there is less acid, maybe something like a cow's milk, we'll have to go with the higher temperature these days. We're going up to 92 degrees for a shorter period of the time, and that's how the cow's milk on the right hand side photo is preserved for a chilled alley, pretty much. Then moving to something with extended shelf life, we'll move to sterilization. High temperature sterilization creates extended shelf life product. So this will be this type of process will be responsible for most of the products stored in the chilled alley. Nevertheless, some of them, as I mentioned before, will be processed with ultra high temperature. So again, we're going slightly higher on the scale of the temperature. This is the highest we can actually process the product without burning it. So the temperature will start from 135 degrees of Celsius and can go up to 100, almost 150, and in some cases even a little bit higher. But then if we push it too high, then we have all sorts of problems. So on average, the products on the UHT will be processed around 138 to 145, I would say. That's the average temperature range. And with that process in place, that temperature with relatively short time, combined with aseptic filling equipment, that could be a Elopak, Tetra Pak, Combi. There is quite a lot of them in terms of the cartons, and also there will be different type of bottle lines that are aseptic as well. Combining all those technologies, we can actually create a product that you'll find in an ambient ambient section in the stores, and something you can actually store with 12 months shelf life.
Thank you very much. And I suppose if we were trying to visualize some of those similarities and differences, I think this is an excellent slide. We can go through it together briefly, if you don't mind, just to be able to understand the different time and temperature that are applied to those products, whether it is for the refrigerated section or the long shelf life type of products.
So again, so this is just a visual version of what I just explained. 62 degrees is pretty much bare minimum. We can go slightly lower on the temperature as well, but again, I don't want to get to very specialized type of product. So let's stick to 62 degrees as a guideline for now. So anything between 62 and higher will be our low temperature, low time, going to a high temperature short time. So anything in between 62 pushing towards 100, that's basically our pasteurization temperatures. Anything above that will move to sterilization type of thermal processing, and this type of thermal processing was really interesting because there's several reasons why this type of process will preserve the product for so long. In order to get from the physical and thermal perspective to 150 degrees of Celsius or even higher to 135, heating itself is not good enough anymore. You need to increase the pressure as well to just get to that temperatures, basically. So we're looking at combination of both pressure and temperature, which as a combination helps us not only kill microorganisms, but also their survival spores. And that we can achieve with ultra high temperature. So when we push our temperature and temperature in this case to 135 degrees, combining that with pressure, not only alive bacteria can be killed, but also the survival spores of the bacteria. I mean, by bacteria, I mean pathogens. There is a really good example of bacteria and technological example that can survive UHT are a specific type of probiotics preserved and protected by protein shell. So this is a really cool technology actually that allows us to process the product under UHT conditions, so a combination of high temperature and the pressure, and yet preserve probiotics in the finished product. So again, this is where UPF is actually very positive. So imagine creating a product with the gut bacteria that can stay on the shelf for a relatively long period of the time. So combination of those technologies can allow us to actually create something like that. So that's really cool.
So there is a balance that needs to be found between maintaining quality, safety, nutrition, and also not going overboard and having some issues during the processing or the manufacturing of the product. So I am curious to hear, what are the actual type of criteria and parameter that's going to influence some of those decisions?
Yeah, so this is very handy matrix, I would say, and please take it with a pinch of salt because it's very important to add that these are only guidelines. So every single recipe formulation needs to be created case by case basis. So we cannot really apply everything from here to every single recipe. The recipes are so diversified these days that some of these processes will be very useful, but in some cases those processes or methods will be counterproductive as well. So, but as a overall guidelines, this is a very useful thing, and this is a good information matrix that could help developer to start with the formulation selection of the equipment for a specific formulation of the product as well. And I think before I will just go into more details, it's also important to mention that when one starts or approach a new project with the specific formulation in mind, let's say a functional high protein, low acid, long shelf life beverage. It is important to remember before we go into selection of ingredients, it is important to remember and start with finding out the right factory or the factory the product will be produced in, and finding out the type of the processing equipment they have in place. And only with that knowledge, we can start designing the recipe itself, selecting the stabilizing systems, selecting the right protein, hydration time, etc., etc. So just going into that matrix quickly and going through it, I highlighted 4 different main aspects when it comes to raw blend processing, and then not thermal but mechanical process in form of the homogenization as well. So let's start from the right hand side of that formulation matrix. We have a pH. So pH is really important for beverages, especially when you go to those higher temperatures and with the specific level of protein content in the product, for instance. So in order to protect those proteins in the formulation at higher temperatures, it's always good practice to measure the pH and balance that pH at as neutral as possible. Basically, we don't want to go too high, too alkalic. We don't want to go too low, too acidic, because that may upset the protein. That's where we can see separation of the product, coagulation of the proteins, or instability of plant milks in coffee and tea, for instance. This is quite important as well. And then you can actually see all those guidelines on the high-share hydration and homogenization as well. So let's just go with plant dairy analog for as example, a quick example. So high-share will be important for added gums, added fats into the water solution. So the high-share element helps us to incorporate everything into the water phase, creating that initial emulsion and activation of certain powder stabilizing systems like cellulose, ghrelin, hydration of the ghrelin, hydration of the protein, for instance, etc., etc. So again, this actually goes really together. High-share itself will help with the hydration. In certain cases, the hydration can happen without high-share. So just the process of adding ingredients into the water with gentle agitation will be enough. But high-share is always a good type of process to have in place, basically, when we incorporate anything into the liquids. And then obviously homogenization, this is a very important step in the process. There are 2 main, I wouldn't call it the types of homogenization, but rather a place where the homogenization is placed. Homogenization can happen before or after the thermal heat treatment. So let's go with UHT for this, for the sake of this discussion. So it could be before UHT or after UHT. With certain ingredients, if we're making long shelf life UHT dairy shake with added starch, I would definitely recommend to go with upstream homogenization, because once the starch is activated, the last thing you really want to do is basically homogenize that starch and just break it down. We will lose the viscosity. So it's always good to do it that way around. On the contrary, when we go with specific stabilizing systems, for instance, if we don't homogenize them after thermal treatment, they will create the small pockets of more dense product within the liquid phase, basically. So it's always good to do it after the final activation of those stabilizing systems, basically. But that's everything. Obviously, I hope this will be useful for some people as well. And as I said, in certain cases, like for instance, meal replacement drink, I mentioned homogenization as a downstream step. There will be certain formulation, I'm 100% sure about it, where upstream will be preferable. So again, this is, but in many cases, I think all the meal replacement drinks we created in the past were using a downstream. So that's why I put it as a downstream in this particular case. But yeah, that's everything, I guess, on this one.
Thank you very much. Obviously, a very complex area for sure. And I think, throughout our webinar today, we have covered quite a number of important aspects of processing and technology and how that can be used to fortify our foods or our beverages, but also to ensure quality, safety throughout shelf life. So we have looked at the definition, the classification, discuss how consumers may have a different perception than what we know in terms of, our knowledge in the food industry and how those foods can be processed to the benefit of our consumer. But we need to educate to be very transparent in terms of how those ingredients are being selected and how those products are being developed and commercialized. And last but not least, I think we can understand a little bit more now on how different product categories would need to be carefully evaluated, and the appropriate processing and technology would need to be optimized, adjusted in order to achieve the right outcome as we discussed it today. So again, just maybe going back to food buzz, I mean, you obviously have an awful lot of experience and expertise in that domain, but if I had a new product or a new idea, are we saying that you could pretty much help me to develop and commercialize this product? Because I hear from you earlier that we need to be very aware on some of the equipment that is available and how ingredient selection and formulation are important. So let's say, even in terms of timeline, you have a lot of experience in that space. Can you just give us a rough indication on the steps that would be required and how long that would take?
That's a great question, Rafael. So it really all depends on the kind of product that is in question that needs to be developed. So, we would typically look at sort of the ingredients that need to be sourced to make up the composition of that particular recipe. And, within the sort of development life cycle, I would say, typically, and again, this is really, like I said, based on the kind of ingredients that the specific product brief in question, but typically it could take anywhere sort of between 8 to 12 weeks. And that is just the product development cycle on its own. But parallel to that are some of the discussions that need to be had, like, for example, Matt mentioned about the kind of co-manufacturer that we're working with or the brand would like to work with. So the packaging plays a very important role, obviously, and with packaging comes its own sort of lead time. Ingredients have their own lead time as well. So, before we are anywhere near factory ready, you're looking at minimum of, sort of 6 to 9 months. And again, once, we've got the packaging, we've got the ingredients and the working with the lead times and with suppliers on this, you would still need to understand what sort of availability the manufacturer might have to get this product to their factory, what kind of approvals are required, and we have to follow their systems and protocols as well. So it's a really complex process, and one must never underestimate the amount of time that it actually takes to get the product factory ready. So I would say, in summary, it would take anywhere sort of between 6 to 9 months, and that's just a conservative estimate.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a massive acceleration if any of us was going to start this journey on their own. The fact that, we could leverage your experience and your expertise in terms of ingredients, which ingredients are likely to be more functional or more nutritional in terms of fortification, even in terms of formulation, which ingredients work well together or would not necessarily interact with each other in a way that would create a stable product. And maybe just to highlight as well the importance of optimizing the time and the temperature that is going to put the product under a lot of stress. And maybe one aspect that can be easily underestimated, I think, is packaging. So we spoke earlier about, packaging innovation as a conveyor of education, communication with the consumer, but also very critical in terms of positioning and in terms of front label type of information, and also in terms of potentially even brand differentiation. But this has to be aligned with how we are going to scale the product in terms of identifying the right partner or building this line independently. So those are the type of questions that anybody who wants to develop and commercialize a product would need to address. And I think that your expertise and your experience in this space is obviously going to accelerate some of those timelines. So thank you very much for going through that with us today. I think I'm going to try to see if I can leave the presentation mode and maybe hand you over to Siobhan here for a minute if we have any questions from our audience.
Nothing has come through, but I think there was just so much information that it will probably take a lot of us who are not experts like the three of you to really digest. So I do highly recommend everyone who has joined today and potentially anyone who will watch the recording to reach out to any one of these three professionals. Ask your questions, engage. We will also be sharing the recording with you. And if you would like a copy of the slides, please also reach out.
Okay, with this, I would like to thank you all for attending our webinar today, and thank you to our guests, Shimi and Matt, for explaining to us a lot about your experience, your expertise, and some of those misconceptions that might be out there about what ultra-processed food is and how the processing of food is actually very important to maintain quality, safety, and nutrition of those type of products. A big thank you to yourself as well, Siobhan, for coordinating and leading a lot of those activities that need to happen in the back end to make those webinars and events happen seamlessly. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing from you guys. Don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll come back to you if there is anything we can help you with. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.